Our discussion for today is the continuation of the Spanish period, the birth of Filipino nationalism and propaganda movement, the Katipunan Revolution of 1896, the Pact of Biak na Bato, the revolutionary government, and Philippine-American War. Propaganda movement, reform and national consciousness movement that arose among young Filipino expatriates in the late 19th century. Although its adherents expressed loyalty to the Spanish colonial government, Spanish authorities harshly repressed the movement and executed the most prominent member, Jose Rizal. Public education did not arrive in the Philippines until 1860s, and even the Roman Catholic Church controlled the curriculum. Because the Spanish friars made comparatively little effort to inculcate a knowledge of Castilian, less than one-fifth of those who went to school could read and write Spanish, and far fewer could speak it. The Filipino populace was thus kept apart from the colonial power that had been ruling it for more than 3 centuries. After the construction of the Suez Canal in 1869, sons of the wealthy were sent to Spain and other countries for study. At home and abroad, a growing sense of Filipino identity had begun to manifest, and in 1872, this burgeoning nationalism spawned an armed insurrection. About 200 Filipino soldiers at Cavite Arsenal revolted, killed their officers, and shouted for independence. Plans for a similar demonstration in Manila failed. The rebellion was quickly suppressed and led to wholesale arrests, life imprisonment, and the execution of, among others, 3 Filipino priests whose connection with the uprising was not satisfactorily explained. In 1888, Filipino expatriate journalist Graciano Lopez Haina founded the newspaper La Solidaridad in Barcelona. Throughout its course, La Solidaridad urged reforms in both religion and government in the Philippines, and it served as the voice of what became known as the propaganda movement. One of the foremost contributors to La Solidaridad was the precocious Jose Rizal A. Mercado. Rizal wrote 2 political novels, the Noli Me Tangere, which means Touch Me Not, and the El Filibusterismo, or in other words, the Reign of the Greed, which had a wide impact in the Philippines. Lopez Haina, Rizal, and journalist Marcelo del Pilar emerged as the 3 leading figures of the propaganda movement, and magazines, poetry, and pamphleteering flourished. While Lopez Haina and Pilar remained abroad, in 1892, Rizal returned home and founded the La Liga Filipina, a modest reform-minded society that was loyal to Spain and breathed no word of independence. As with the Cavite Mutiny, the Spanish authorities overreacted to a perceived threat to their rule. They promptly arrested and exiled Rizal to a remote island in the south. Meanwhile, within the Philippines, there had developed a firm commitment to independence among the somewhat less privileged class. Shocked by the arrest of Rizal, these activists formed the Katipunan under the leadership of Andres Bonifacio, a self-educated warehouseman. The Katipunan was dedicated to the expulsion of the Spanish from the islands, and preparations were made for armed revolt. There had been many Filipino rebels throughout the history of Spanish rule, but now, for the first time, they were inspired by nationalist ambitions and possessed the education needed to make success a real possibility. On August 26, 1896, Bonifacio issued the Grito de Balintawak, or in other words, the Cry of Balintawak, calling for an armed uprising against the Spanish. The center of the revolt was in Cavite province, where Filipino independence leader Emilio Aguinaldo first came into prominence. Spain sent reinforcements until there was an army of 28,000, along with a few loyal regiments of Filipino soldiers. A stiff campaign of 52 days brought about the defeat of the insurgents, but the Spanish once again endeavored to work against their own interests. Although Rizal had no connection to the uprising of the Katipunan, the Spanish military arrested him and, after a farcical trial, found him guilty of sedition. He was executed by a firing squad in Manila on December 30, 1896. Signed on November 1, 1897, The Biak na Bato Constitution provided the establishment of a Supreme Council that would serve as the highest governing body of the Republic. It also outlined certain basic human rights such as freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and the right to education. Aguinaldo and his fellow revolutionaries were given amnesty and monetary indemnity by the Spanish government, in return for which the revolutionary government would go into exile in Hong Kong. Aguinaldo had decided to use the money to purchase advanced firearms and ammunition, later on returned to the archipelago. On December 23, 1897, Generals Celestino Tejero and Ricardo Monet of the Spanish army arrived in Biak na Bato and became hostages of the rebels. A ceasefire was declared by both camps, and an agreement between Aguinaldo and the Spanish forces was made that the Spanish government will grant self-rule to the Philippines in 3 years if Aguinaldo went to exile and surrender his arms. In exchange, Aguinaldo will receive 800,000 Mexican pesos as remuneration to the revolutionaries and an amnesty. After receiving a partial payment of 400,000, Aguinaldo left for Hong Kong on December 27, 1897. Some Filipino generals, however, did not believe in the sincerity of the Spaniards. They refused to surrender their arms. Nevertheless, the Te Deum was still sung on January 23, 1898. The Filipinos and the Spaniards did not trust each other. As a result, periodic clashes between the two groups still took place even after Aguinaldo's departure from the country. The Spanish did not pay the entire agreed amount. During the Spanish-American War, Filipino rebels led by Aguinaldo proclaimed the independence of the Philippines after 300 years of Spanish rule. By mid-August, Filipino rebels and U.S. troops had ousted the Spanish, but Aguinaldo's hopes for independence were dashed when the United States formally annexed the Philippines as part of its peace treaty with Spain. In April 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out over Spain's brutal suppression of a rebellion in Cuba, the first in a series of decisive U.S. victories recorded on May 1, 1898, when the U.S. Asiatic Squadron under Commodore George Dewey annihilated the Spanish Pacific Fleet at the Battle of Manila Bay. From his exile, Aguinaldo made arrangements with U.S. authorities to return to the Philippines and assist the United States in the war against Spain. He landed on May 19, rallied his revolutionaries, and began liberating towns south of Manila. On June 12, he proclaimed Philippine independence and established a provincial government of which he subsequently became head. His rebels, meanwhile, had encircled the Spanish in Manila, and with the support of Dewey's squadron in Manila Bay, would surely have conquered the Spanish. Dewey, however, was waiting for U.S. ground troops, which began landing in July and took over the Filipino position surrounding Manila. On August 8, the Spanish commander informed the United States that he would surrender to the city under two conditions. The United States was to make the advance into the capital look like a battle, and no conditions were the Filipino rebels to be allowed into the city. On August 13, the mock Battle of Manila Bay was staged, and the Americans kept their promise to keep the Filipinos out after the city passed into their hands. While the Americans occupied Manila and planned peace negotiations with Spain, Aguinaldo convened a revolutionary assembly, the Malolos, in September. They drew up a democratic constitution, the first ever in Asia, and a government was formed with Aguinaldo as president in January 1899. On February 4, what became known as the Philippine Insurrection began when Filipino rebels and U.S. troops skirmished inside American lines in Manila. 2 days later, the U.S. Senate voted by one vote to ratify the Treaty of Paris with Spain. The Philippines was now a U.S. territory, acquired in exchange for $20 million in compensation to the Spanish. In response, Aguinaldo formally launched a new revolt, this time against the United States. The rebels, consistently defeated in the open field, turned to guerrilla warfare, and the U.S. Congress authorized the deployment of 60,000 troops to subdue them. By the end of 1899, there were 65,000 U.S. troops in the Philippines, but the war dragged on. Many anti-imperialists in the United States, such as Democratic presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan opposed U.S. annexation of the Philippines, but in November 1900, Republican incumbent William McKinley was re-elected and the war continued. On March 23, 1901, in a daring operation, U.S. General Frederick Funston and a group of officers pretending to be prisoners surprised Aguinaldo in his stronghold in the Luzon village of Palanan and captured the rebel leader. Aguinaldo took an oath of allegiance to the United States and called for an end to the rebellion, but many of his followers fought on. During the next year, U.S. forces gradually pacified the Philippines. In an infamous episode, U.S. forces on the island of Samar retaliated against the massacre of a U.S. garrison by killing all men on the island above the age of 10. Many women and young children were also butchered. General Jacob Smith, who directed the atrocities, was court-martialed and forced to retire for turning Samar, in his words, into a howling wilderness. In 1902, an American civil government took over administration of the Philippines, and the 3-year Philippine insurrection was declared to be at an end. Scattered resistance, however, persisted for several years. More than 4,000 Americans perished suppressing the Philippines, more than 10 times the number killed in Spanish-American War. More than 20,000 Filipino insurgents were killed and an unknown number of civilians perished. In 1935, the Commonwealth of the Philippines was established with U.S. approval and Manuel Quezon was elected the country's first president. On July 4, 1946, full independence was granted to the Republic of the Philippines by the United States. Before we end, let me leave you with a wonderful message of Jose Rizal, which says, "There can be no tyrants where there are no slaves." Keep safe everyone, God bless, and see you next meeting.